Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. It is, of course, Thursday, which is the Farmer Rapid Fire, brought to you by Corteva. Joining me now, I've got Rhett Duke out of Saskatchewan. Rhett, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you doing this morning, Lindsay?
I'm doing well. How are things your way? Are you stuck in the deep freeze?
We still are in the deep freeze, but looking at a bit of a warm up potentially this weekend. So looking forward to it, to tell you the truth.
Yes. Now, what this very cold weather does mean, it does mean that it's a great time to sit at the desk or at the table and do planning and get all those decisions, as many of those early decisions made as possible. What are you navigating with clients right now? What sort of planning is happening?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, at this time of the year, I think pretty much everything is fair game for that planning cycle. And, I think a lot of guys are looking at the 2026 season. They're thinking about the tight margins in front of them. I know a lot of the input decisions have been, quite frankly, put under the microscope. But in the same breath, I know a lot of farmers, they're still focused on getting the most out of every acre out there. And, speaking to South Sask specifically, a big theme I'm hearing as we head into the 2026 season is risk management. So, that can take a number of shapes and forms, anything from weather risk to pest risk from weeds, insects, disease. And ultimately, trying to create that game plan that's going to make sure that we're set up for early season success. Unfortunately, in some cases, the conversation turns to, well, I want to, or I'm thinking about cutting costs by X number of dollars per acre. And, from an agronomy perspective, and as a farmer myself, I can definitely appreciate trying to manage input costs. But I think we also need to really focus on establishing a healthy, competitive crop that's going to allow us to compete against the typical plethora of pests that we see early season.
Now you mentioned growers, of course, really focused on that yield component on those max bushels per acre, because of course, yes, when crop prices aren't great, having more bushels to sell can sometimes help temper that a little bit. We had, for much of the prairies, phenomenal bushels, phenomenal yield in many areas. So how does that play into exactly that planning for this year of wanting to manage some of that risk, but still chasing those big yields?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, big yields were definitely a part of the tail end of the 2026 season. And I think people are wanting to continue that, right? So, from my perspective, nobody kind of has that crystal ball or that spidey sense to know what those early spring conditions are going to bring. And quite frankly, it really doesn't matter because regardless of whether it's warm and dry or cool and wet, that's going to favor a soil-borne pathogen. So typically in Western Canada, we usually trend to be a dry, hot bias, and that's going to cause an uptick in Fusarium species or Cochlea bolus sativus. Whereas if we do decide to come out of the gate cool and wet, that's going to favor kind of Pythium and Rhizoctonia species. So my message is selecting a really solid broad spectrum cereal fungicide seed treatment, something like Corteva's new Lumisand Lux, will ensure that you have superior disease protection and maximize yield potential no matter what that early season throws at you.
I don't know that we've ever had an ideal seeding season, have we?
Exactly.
I think
Yeah.
it's one of those, like maybe once in your entire career you'll get that. So great point. When we talk about managing risk, when we talk about max yield, we have to set this crop up as good as possible so that we can maximize all the inputs that we do put in. So seed treatments are a key part of that. The other thing that I keep coming back to in a lot of these conversations over ROI is probably one of the biggest slam dunks in bang for your buck is early weed control and making sure that you're starting that crop off with as little competition as possible. So where does that fit into sort of that discussion of, how you broach early weed control?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a common one, right? I think, at that time of the game, we're so focused on getting the seed, getting the fertility in the ground, and kind of making sure we're able to cover those acres in a timely manner because we all understand the advantage of getting the seed in the ground early. But I think in that same breath, we also have to, really understand that although those weeds are out in the field and they may be fairly few and far between, letting them get going and not executing pre-seed burn down is really one of those huge things that can rob us of a lot of yield, right? And I think we've done a lot of good work here in the last 5, even 8 years by getting folks to understand the importance of tank mixing that glyphosate with something that contains multiple effective modes of action. Essentially, think of it like you're trying to kill each weed in the field twice with more than one mode of action, right? And the way I think about that is it's really going to set you up for success. To be very, very simple about this, I think about all the weeds in the field. You're kind of killing 50% of them with that pre-seed burn down, and you're killing the other 50% of them with your in-crop application. And I know that's a very rudimentary example, but quite frankly, if we let that first 50% go out of the gate, it really challenges us throughout the season. Then when we come in at in-crop timing, we're trying to take down big honking weeds, and they may actually create shading opportunities for some of those smaller weeds on the ground that, quite frankly, are going to escape, and they're going to continue to rob us of yield throughout the season. And the worst part is, if some of those do escape, obviously they're going to set seed, and we're going to be dealing with that issue kind of in a compounding nature going forward. And this isn't Corteva research. This is really ag industry research broadly, not just within Canada but globally. We know for sure that first basically 3-4 weeks of the season after that new seed pops out of the ground, that represents what is called the critical weed free period. And that would be the time in the crop's life cycle where it is the most susceptible to yield loss from weed competition. So making sure we're as clean as possible during that time is critical and paramount to producing a high yielding crop. And in my opinion, it's not something we think about in terms of a return on investment, but that early season weed control, it really is one of the highest returns we make per acre every year. So
Mhm.
critical to do for sure.
And you bring up an excellent point. When you really dig into when, say, cereals set yield potential, it's really early in the season, right? So, as much as sometimes it can feel good to get in there with the in crop, because you can see those weeds and you want to knock them back. Sometimes the damage is done. Like, and so,
Exactly.
right? So if you really want to get bang for your buck, it's got to be early. So good messages there. We need to protect that seed. We need to protect that seedling with the right seed treatment, and then we've got to make sure we've got our early weed control. We could probably do a whole other discussion on, do you seed first or do you do your pre-seed burn down? Maybe we'll talk about that next time, Rhett. We got to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining me here on Real Ag Radio. Really appreciate it. Hope it warms up.
Yeah, thanks. You too, Lizzie. Take care.
All right, that does it for us here on Real Ag Radio. We'll talk to you again tomorrow for the issues panel. Cheers, everybody.